Welcome. Before we begin this chilling and almost forgotten case from 1859 Georgia, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And make sure you subscribe because it takes a lot of time, research, and deep digging into old records to bring you real stories like this. Today's tale is about a silent trick, a method so strange and so subtle that it left 19 overseers unable to see, and yet no one could ever prove exactly how it happened. This story remained buried for decades, but today we're uncovering every eerie detail. The first overseer, who fell victim to the strange blindness, had no reason to believe anything unusual was happening that morning. He was a man known for his harsh discipline, someone who walked the fields with a constant suspicion in his eyes, always searching for any sign of disobedience. On that particular day, the air was thick with Georgia humidity, and the plantation was unusually quiet. He later claimed that the quiet itself felt wrong, as if everyone had agreed to hold their breath at the same time. He didn't hear whispers, he didn't hear footsteps, and he didn't see anyone approaching him directly. Instead, he noticed a single worker standing at the far end of the field, completely still, looking his way without moving a muscle. The overseer felt irritated, thinking it was some kind of challenge or mockery, so he took a few steps toward the figure. But as he did, the worker lowered his gaze, lifted one hand slowly, and made a movement so small and so gentle that the overseer couldn't even describe it later. It wasn't a wave. It wasn't a signal to someone else. It was almost like the flick of a finger, a tiny gesture that carried no sound and no apparent meaning. Yet in that exact moment, the overseer felt something like a rush of heat behind his eyes. Not pain, not burning, just a sensation that something inside his vision had shifted. He blinked hard, shook his head, and muttered to himself, thinking it was the sun or maybe dust. But within seconds, that strange sensation spread, turning into blurriness. The edges of the world began dissolving, melting into unfocused shapes. He thought he was fainting or dehydrated, so he leaned against a post, trying to steady himself. But the blurriness didn't fade, it deepened. He stumbled forward, shouting for one of the field hands to bring him water, but even as he spoke, he realized he wasn't seeing faces anymore, only shadows. Panic rose in his chest. He tried to blink the darkness away, rubbing his eyes with both hands, but that only made the world dim even faster. Within minutes, he couldn't distinguish light from shadow at all. Those who witnessed it said he staggered around like he'd been struck blind by some invisible force. No injury, no mark, no blow, just sudden blindness out of nowhere. When he was taken back to the main house, he kept insisting that someone had done something silent. To him, that the gesture he saw wasn't innocent. But no one could understand what he meant. The doctors who examined him found his eyes perfectly normal. No trauma, no swelling, no infection. He simply couldn't see, as if someone had turned off the world around him. That first case set off a quiet ripple of fear across the plantation. It didn't make sense. There was no explanation, no natural cause. And it wasn't long before people began whispering about the worker who had stood so still in the field, the one who had made that tiny, silent gesture. The overseer himself kept repeating just one detail before his sight faded forever, that the trick, whatever it was, made no sound at all. Before each incident, the workers on the plantation began showing behaviors that seemed unusual to the overseers, but subtle enough that no one could accuse them of anything openly. It started with the way they moved, slow, synchronized, almost like they were following an invisible rhythm that no outsider could hear. Overseers would walk through the fields and notice that workers who normally whispered, muttered, or sang under their breath were suddenly silent. Their eyes lowered, but their focus strangely sharp. It created an atmosphere that felt tense without anyone needing to speak. Some overseers described it as the feeling of walking into a room where everyone already knew something you didn't. They couldn't explain it, but they could feel it. What made it even stranger was how the workers seemed to position themselves, choosing spots that gave them clear lines of sight to one another across the field. A man at the far end would glance to a woman near the middle row, and she would respond with the tiniest movement, barely visible, almost ghost-like. Sometimes it was just a shift of the shoulders, sometimes a slight tilt of the head, but whatever it was, it always looked too coordinated to be accidental. Overseers reported that once they noticed these movements, the workers would immediately revert to normal positions, pretending to be focused on their tasks. It was as if they were communicating in a language that didn't need sound, a language built on instinct and timing. On several mornings, overseers walked into the fields and felt as if they were being watched, though whenever they turned, everyone seemed busy and obedient. But if they stepped out of the fields, just for a moment, to fetch tools or check on the barns, the workers would reposition themselves quickly, almost snapping into new formations without making a sound. One overseer said that every time he returned from a short walk, the workers were no longer where he had left them, yet they acted as if nothing had shifted at all. Another claimed he caught two men looking straight at him until the exact second he blinked, almost as if they were waiting for his eyelids to close before returning to work. Some workers began walking slightly slower when an overseer came near, dragging out movements that seemed harmless but were perfectly timed. Others stared at the ground but sidestepped at the precise moment an overseer passed behind them, moving just enough to make the overseer feel off, balance, or uncertain. These behaviors were never aggressive, never loud, and never blatant enough to be punishable. It was the quietness, too quiet, that sent a cold feeling through the overseers' bodies. The strangest behavior came right before each case of blindness. The workers in the surrounding area would freeze for a few seconds, almost like statues. They would stay perfectly still, eyes downward, bodies relaxed. No tension in their faces. They didn't look scared. They didn't look angry. They looked ready. It was a kind of calm that felt unnatural to the overseers, like the air before a storm when everything stops moving. One overseer later admitted that the stillness made him feel as if the entire field was holding its breath together, waiting for a moment he couldn't predict. Supervisors who survived those early days recalled that whenever one of them later went blind, the workers in that area had shown the same eerie stillness moments before it happened. They didn't touch the overseer, didn't get near him, didn't even speak. They just watched silently, as if they already knew what would follow. And the overseer, without fail, would fall victim soon after. The patterns were too consistent to ignore, yet too quiet and subtle to accuse anyone of anything directly. Plantation owners believed the behaviors were harmless or simply misinterpreted, but the overseers who experienced them felt something deeper, a coordinated silence, a shared understanding, and a sense that the workers knew exactly what they were doing long before the overseers realized anything was wrong. The most unsettling part of the entire ordeal was how the overseers lost their vision in nearly identical ways, again and again, without a single physical injury ever being found. These weren't men who were struck, poisoned, or attacked. There were no bruises, no swelling, no blood, no redness in the eyes, nothing that suggested harm had been done at all. Every case followed the same eerie pattern, as if the plantation itself had fallen under some invisible rule that no one could break or understand. It always began with a subtle moment, something so small that most overseers didn't think twice about it, a faint warmth behind the eyes, a flicker in their peripheral vision, or a quick flash of light that didn't seem to come from the sun. They would blink, wipe their faces, maybe rub their eyelids with a dusty hand, assuming it was sweat or grit from the fields. But almost immediately after, the world around them would begin to shift in a way that didn't make sense. Colors would drain first, turning into pale streaks like fading paint. Then edges would soften, as if the world were melting into a watercolor. Some overseers described it as looking through fogged glass, except the fog kept thickening no matter how many times they wiped their eyes. Others said their vision dimmed as though someone was slowly lowering a curtain, not all at once but inch by inch, giving them just enough time to panic as the darkness crept in. And in every case, the blindness took hold within minutes, sometimes even seconds. There was no warning, no chance to call for help, no way to slow it down. Men who had never believed in superstition began screaming that their minds were being tricked, or that someone had cast something on them without touching them. One overseer fell to his knees in front of witnesses, clawing at his face as if trying to peel something off his eyes. Another stumbled blindly into a fence, collapsing as he begged someone to turn the light back on. What made it worse was how differently each man reacted emotionally to the same silent phenomenon. Some became violent, thrashing around in panic. Others froze completely, whispering that they could still hear everything, but that the world had vanished. A few didn't speak at all, sitting quietly on the ground, stunned into silence. But in every case, the most disturbing detail was this: the blindness didn't fade. It didn't clear up after rest, after washing, or after medical treatment. Once the vision was gone, it was gone forever. Doctors from neighboring counties examined the overseers and found nothing physically wrong with their eyes. No cloudiness, no detached retinas, no sign of infection or inflammation. The physicians were baffled, insisting that the only explanation was something affecting the mind, not the eyes. Yet even that didn't fit, because each man's memory and awareness remained sharp. They knew where they were. They knew who they were talking to. They just couldn't see. The repetition of these incidents created a cycle of fear across the plantation. Overseers began working in pairs, refusing to walk alone through the fields. They tried wearing cloth over their eyes to shield themselves from dust or sunlight, thinking maybe it was environmental. Others carried small mirrors, checking their eyes every hour. Some avoided making direct eye contact with workers, believing that maybe the blindness came from a glance or a shared moment. But none of their precautions mattered. The pattern remained unbroken: the warmth, the fading colors, the melting shapes, and then the dark. By the time several overseers had gone blind in this same mysterious manner, the rumor that something silent, was being used against them grew even stronger. It was no longer just coincidence to them. It was a pattern too precise to ignore. The plantation's atmosphere shifted into paranoia and dread. Men who once walked with authority now moved cautiously, flinching at the slightest movement in their peripheral vision. They were terrified not of physical attack, but of something much worse, harm that left no trace. No wound and no warning. A force that seemed to slip through the air quietly, invisibly, just before taking the only thing they relied on to maintain control. Their sight. Rumors of a secret signal passed silently among the enslaved began to spread long before anyone dared to say it out loud. And those rumors were fueled by moments that overseers couldn't explain, no matter how many times they replayed them in their minds. It wasn't just the strange stillness or the quiet coordination. It was something deeper, something that felt intentional even though no one ever heard a sound or saw a clear gesture. Overseers claimed that right before each incident of blindness, there was always a moment when one worker would lock eyes with another across the field. And then something would pass between them, something invisible yet powerful enough to make the overseer feel watched, measured, or judged. It was never an obvious signal, nothing that could be punished or written down in a report, but the sensation was undeniable. It felt like being surrounded by people who were communicating in a way that outsiders couldn't decode. Word spread that the enslaved had developed a system using micro-movements, tiny shifts of the eyes, small twitches of the fingers, barely noticeable tilts of the chin, each carrying a specific meaning. Overseers who fell victim to the blindness insisted afterward that just before it began, they saw someone make one of these small gestures. The problem was that every gesture seemed different. Some overseers described seeing a worker glance at the sky for half a second. Others mentioned a hand brushing the side of a leg. A few said they saw someone adjust their posture in a way that didn't match the rest of the field. None of these actions looked threatening on their own. But when these men went blind minutes later, those tiny moments began to look far more meaningful. The idea of a silent signal terrified the overseers more than anything physical ever could. If the workers had a hidden language, then the overseers were effectively blind, even before the blindness struck. They didn't know when the next signal would be made. They didn't know who was giving it or who was receiving it. They didn't even know what the signal meant. All they knew was that every time someone reported seeing a subtle gesture, a man lost his vision shortly afterward. It created a paranoia that ate away at the overseer's confidence. They began to believe that the workers weren't just laboring under the sun. They were watching, waiting, and passing silent instructions that only they could understand. Some plantation owners dismissed these claims, assuming the overseers were exaggerating or finding excuses for their failures. But the overseers themselves, the ones who walked the fields every day, swore that the workers moved with a shared awareness. They said that when one worker shifted his weight, another on the opposite end of the field would respond immediately, as if the gesture had traveled across the air like a whisper no one else could hear. Investigations were attempted, though none were official. Overseers tried separating workers to break their supposed communication, but the strange unity persisted. Even when people were placed in different sections of the plantation, the same eerie coordination continued. No matter the distance, No matter the obstacles, they seemed connected. The belief in the silent signal became stronger when several overseers, in separate incidents, reported the same chilling detail. That just before their vision began to fade, they heard a single soft exhale from someone nearby. It wasn't a word, not a whistle, not even a grunt. Just a slow breath, as if someone had released tension at the exact moment the overseer's sight was taken. The overseers couldn't prove anything, but they believed those breaths were confirmations, like the final step in a sequence that had been silently agreed upon. As fear grew, rumors transformed into something even more unsettling, that the workers didn't just use signals to communicate with each other, but that they used those signals to trigger whatever force was causing the blindness. Overseers whispered that the silent gestures weren't instructions. They were activations, cues for something invisible to strike. Whether they believed it was psychological, spiritual, or something else entirely, each overseer who went blind insisted up until the final moment that the signal was real. It didn't matter that no outsider ever saw a pattern. It didn't matter that no one could prove anything in court or on paper. What mattered was the terror that overtook the men in charge, the fear that the power they believed they had could be undone by a movement so small, so silent, and so perfectly timed that it felt almost supernatural. And in 1859 Georgia, where silence could be more dangerous than noise, that belief spread like wildfire, turning a whisper into a legend too large to ignore. Local doctors and healers were called to investigate the series of mysterious incidents. But no matter how many tests they conducted or remedies they attempted, they could find no explanation. They examined the eyes of each blinded overseer, expecting perhaps to find infection, trauma, or a chemical irritant. They looked for inflammation, cloudness, detached retinas, or any physical anomaly that could account for the sudden loss of vision. But every time the results came back the same: the eyes were perfectly healthy, as if nothing had happened at all. They tested for fatigue, dehydration, exposure to sunlight, and even psychological stress, but none of these factors seemed sufficient to explain the pattern. Each overseer appeared alert, fully aware of their surroundings, and yet completely unable to see. It was a contradiction that defied everything doctors had learned. Some physicians began to suspect hysteria or mass suggestion, claiming that the overseer's fear and paranoia had caused the blindness. But even they struggled to reconcile the fact that 19 men, all in separate incidents, experienced the same sudden, permanent loss of vision without physical cause. There was no hysteria that could explain permanence or the identical progression from initial blur to total darkness. Others proposed that perhaps a rare disease or a latent infection had been silently affecting the overseers, but no two men shared the same symptoms prior to the onset, and none had ever shown signs of illness. Each case was as unique as it was identical, leaving the medical community baffled. Midwives and herbalists on the plantation, often consulted by both workers and overseers, weighed in with their own theories. Some suggested the influence of unseen forces or curses, pointing to local superstitions and stories passed quietly among the enslaved. They warned that the events might not be medical at all, that the hand of a higher power, or some clever trick beyond scientific understanding, was at work. While the overseers scoffed at such ideas at first, the consistency of the events eventually forced them to reconsider. Doctors and officials began debating whether the cause was purely natural or if something far stranger was influencing the outcomes. As more cases occurred, the doctors' frustration grew. They experimented with treatments, warm compresses, herbal salves, attempts at hydration, and even surgical intervention on the eyes, all of which proved useless. Some men recovered partially in terms of perception of light, but none regained true vision. Hospitals documented the cases meticulously, hoping that some pattern might emerge, but the records only added to the mystery. Notes emphasized the sudden onset, the total absence of injury, and the rapid progression from initial blurriness to complete blindness. Doctors could offer no prognosis, no preventive measures, and no explanation that satisfied logic. Even beyond the medical community, the plantation owners grew desperate. They summoned the most respected physicians in the county and promised rewards for anyone who could solve the mystery. Experts from nearby towns and cities traveled to observe the afflicted overseers, yet none could determine a cause. Reports describe physicians pacing the floors of the plantation homes at night, whispering theories of toxins, airborne pathogens, or even psychological contagion. But every suggestion fell short. It was as if the overseer's blindness existed outside the bounds of human understanding, unaffected by medicine or reason. In the eyes of the local population, the doctor's inability to explain the incidents only amplified the fear. If trained professionals, armed with knowledge and tools, could not determine the cause, what hope did ordinary people have? The plantation became a place of anxiety, where each sound, movement, or glance could be interpreted as a signal leading to another case of sudden blindness. Even those who were not directly affected began to speak in hushed tones about the invisible hand that struck without warning. Ultimately, the repeated failures of medical professionals to diagnose or treat the blinded overseers contributed to the legend surrounding the case. Science, despite its methods and authority, could not account for what had happened, which only strengthened the belief that something beyond ordinary understanding was at play. Every physician who studied the events admitted privately that they had no explanation, and their professional inability to intervene left the overseers and the community grasping for answers, trapped between fear, superstition, and the unsettling realization that some phenomena might exist entirely outside the reach of science. The unanswered questions lingered long after the events, making the case one of the most confounding medical mysteries of its time. It wasn't just that the overseers went blind, it was that the entire system of observation, diagnosis, and treatment that the doctors relied on had failed entirely. The combination of perfect health, sudden and total blindness, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding each incident created a scenario that would haunt the memories of all who were involved. It became a story passed down, a chilling reminder that some forces, whether natural or otherwise, remain beyond explanation, defying even the most skilled and diligent scientific minds. As the strange cases of blindness continued to unfold, plantation owners grew increasingly desperate and fearful, realizing that the events threatened not only their authority, but the entire structure of control on the plantation. The overseers were the backbone of the operations, the ones who enforced rules, managed labor, and maintained discipline. Without their sight, the plantation descended into confusion. Fields went unmonitored, livestock wandered unchecked, and work that had once been efficient now slowed to a crawl. Owners attempted to reinforce security, thinking perhaps that someone was playing a trick, or that the workers had found a way to harm the overseers through deception or sabotage. They stationed guards along pathways, instructed men to travel in pairs, and even tried locking certain areas of the plantation. But none of these measures made a difference. The fear grew especially acute because the incidents seemed to follow no predictable schedule. Overseers who had walked the fields safely one day could lose their vision the next without warning. Owners tried to map patterns, noting times of day, locations in the fields, or the presence of specific workers, hoping to prevent the next occurrence. They even consulted local authorities and neighboring planters, sharing accounts and seeking guidance, yet no one could explain why the blindness was striking with such precision and consistency. The inability to predict the next incident made each day tense and dangerous. Even simple tasks, such as inspecting the crops or checking fences, became exercises in dread. In response to this escalating fear, some owners tried to separate the workers they suspected might be involved, moving them to different parts of the plantation or even sending them temporarily to neighboring plantations. Yet, the phenomenon persisted. It appeared that no matter the arrangements, no matter the precautions, no matter overseer would fall victim. Panic and paranoia grew, and the sense of helplessness began to affect the owners themselves. They questioned whether the situation was the result of an elaborate trick, a supernatural force, or something entirely beyond their comprehension. The combination of fear and desperation led some to take extreme measures, including implementing strict surveillance and punishing minor infractions harshly, even though they had no evidence linking any worker to the incidents. As security increased, the atmosphere on the plantation changed dramatically. Overseers became hesitant and wary, jumping at any unexpected movement or sound. Owners walked the grounds themselves, inspecting laborers with an intensity that had never been necessary before. Even workers who had no involvement in the incidents felt the tension, responding to the overseer's fear with caution and careful observation. The dynamic between the overseers and the enslaved population shifted, introducing a sense of unease that permeated every corner of the plantation. The balance of power, once firmly in the hands of the overseers, now seemed fragile and uncertain. In addition to the immediate fear and disruption, the plantation owners worried about the long-term consequences. Fields left unchecked could result in failed harvests, livestock could be lost, and the overall productivity of the plantation was at risk. There was also the concern that neighboring plantations would see this as a weakness, potentially inviting further unrest or rebellion. Letters and messages were sent to other landowners, sharing the bizarre incidents and asking if anyone had experienced similar occurrences, but responses were scarce. Most either dismissed the reports as exaggeration or chose to ignore them entirely, leaving the owners to deal with the mystery largely on their own. The increasing security measures, while intended to restore control, also added to the sense of dread. Overseers now had to navigate the plantation under constant scrutiny, aware that every small movement could be interpreted as suspicious. Plantation owners were forced to confront the limits of their authority, realizing that money, status, and strict rules could not prevent a force they could not see or understand from undermining their operations. Guards were stationed along paths, Doors were locked at night, and overseers were instructed to always move in pairs or groups. Yet even these efforts failed to prevent the next case of sudden blindness. The community surrounding the plantation also began to take notice. Neighbors whispered about the strange events, sharing rumors of secretive gestures and silent communication among the workers. The idea that a subtle, invisible force could affect the overseers spread fear beyond the plantation itself. Visitors and traders arriving from nearby towns often felt uneasy when traveling through the area, sensing an unspoken tension and listening for stories of the inexplicable events. Some even refused to work or conduct business with the plantation, fearing that proximity to the phenomena could bring misfortune. Despite all precautions, the owners eventually had to admit a terrifying truth: their authority, their security measures, and even their understanding of natural law were powerless against whatever was causing the blindness. The plantation operated under a shadow of fear, every overseer wary, every worker careful, and every owner uncertain. The inability to protect themselves or predict the next incident created an environment where paranoia, suspicion, and helplessness dominated daily life. The growing dread and constant fear were the most profound consequences, demonstrating that the plantation's hierarchy could be disrupted not through force, but through something subtle, silent, and completely unexplainable. The disappearance of the suspected mastermind added yet another layer of fear and mystery to an already unsettling situation. No one could say for certain who or what had orchestrated the events that left 19 overseers blind, but rumors quickly focused on a single figure among the enslaved, someone who seemed to possess an uncanny knowledge of timing, movement, and human perception. This person, whose name was whispered quietly among the workers, but never recorded openly by the overseers, was said to have observed the plantation with extraordinary attention to detail, understanding exactly how the overseers moved, where they looked, and when their focus wavered. It was believed that they could anticipate every action before it happened, orchestrating the strange chain of events with precision that seemed almost impossible. As suspicions mounted, plantation owners attempted to identify and interrogate anyone who might have had a role in the strange incidents. Workers were questioned under the watchful eyes of armed guards, and overseers tried to recall every movement or signal they had seen. Yet the suspected mastermind remained elusive, never appearing during investigations, never making a misstep, and never leaving any concrete evidence behind. The fear that this person was not just clever, but potentially supernatural in their abilities, began to seep into the minds of both overseers and owners. Some whispered that the person could control perception itself, that they had found a way to manipulate sight without touching a single body. Then, one night, the person vanished. No one knew how or when it happened. Workers who had been nearby claimed they saw nothing unusual, no signs of escape, no secret paths used, nothing to explain how someone could disappear so completely. The overseers, already shaken by the repeated incidents of blindness, became convinced that the disappearance was part of the plan, that the person had left at the precise moment when their work was complete, or perhaps to avoid capture now that fear had escalated. The plantation owners were frantic, searching every building, every barn, and even the surrounding woods. Guards were posted for weeks, but the person was never found. The disappearance only intensified the paranoia on the plantation. Overseers became even more cautious, looking over their shoulders constantly, convinced that the mastermind could return at any moment. Every unusual gesture from a worker, every pause in the field, every glance across the rows was scrutinized as potentially significant. Fear of the unknown replaced the usual authority of the overseers, and the very structure of plantation control began to crumble. Even simple tasks, like moving livestock or inspecting crops, became exercises in anxiety. The idea that one person could exert so much influence without ever being caught haunted every corner of the plantation. Stories about the missing individuals spread quickly, first among the enslaved population, and then among neighboring plantations. Some claimed that the person had left for good, disappearing into the wider world, while others believed they remained nearby, observing from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to act again. Overseers reported feeling the same strange sensations they had during the earlier incidents. A sudden blurring of vision, a feeling of being watched, or inexplicable chills. Though the person was gone, the fear and uncertainty lingered, proving that the impact of their presence had been permanent. In some ways, the disappearance reinforced the mystery more than the incidents themselves. Without someone to accuse or hold accountable, the events became impossible to explain or control. Overseers were left to manage the plantation under the constant pressure that the mastermind could return, and owners were forced to confront their inability to maintain authority through conventional means. The idea that a single, silent figure could wield such influence over an entire operation became a legend, a story told in hushed tones by both workers and overseers alike. Even decades later, the story of the missing figure endured. Plantation records mentioned it only indirectly, often omitting names or details, leaving gaps that only fueled speculation. People who lived nearby recounted tales of strange occurrences in the fields, always linking them to the invisible presence of the one who had disappeared. Some believed the person had been a genius, using knowledge of human perception and timing to manipulate events, while others whispered that the person's abilities were supernatural. Either way, the disappearance ensured that no one would ever have definitive answers, cementing the tale as one of Georgia's most baffling and haunting mysteries. Ultimately, the missing figure's vanishing act did more than prevent capture, it created a lasting legend. By leaving without a trace, the individual transformed the incident from a series of unexplainable medical phenomena into a story of cunning, strategy, and perhaps otherworldly skill. The overseer's blindness remained unsolved, the plantation's authority destabilized, and the memory of the mysterious disappearance endured, proving that sometimes it is not only the act itself, but the absence of the actor that has the most powerful effect. The cases spread into legend across Georgia plantations, began almost immediately after the initial incidents, fueled by the combination of fear, confusion, and the sheer impossibility of what had happened. Overseers who had survived shared their stories with colleagues on neighboring estates, recounting the sudden blindness, the strange stillness of the workers, and the subtle gestures that seemed to precede each event. Every retelling added details, some true, some exaggerated, and soon the narrative became something far larger than a single plantation. Whispers of a silent force capable of robbing men of their sight traveled quickly, carried by word of mouth among planters, overseers, and even itinerant workers who moved from plantation to plantation. What had started as an unexplained medical phenomenon transformed into a story that touched fear, superstition, and respect for the unseen intelligence attributed to the enslaved population. As the tale spread, the story became increasingly imbued with myth. People described the blindings as not just accidents, but as deliberate acts of control, a warning to those who sought to enforce cruelty or exploit the laborers too harshly. Overseers and planters began sharing the story cautiously, often emphasizing the idea that the enslaved had developed a kind of secret power, a system so precise and silent that no one could interfere. Each retelling reinforced the narrative of the mysterious figure and the coordinated actions of the workers, transforming the incidents into a cautionary tale about underestimating those who had been oppressed. The legend took on different forms depending on who told it. Among some planters, it was a story of fear and helplessness, illustrating the limits of authority and control over human beings. Among workers, the tale was often recounted as a demonstration of cleverness and subtle resistance, emphasizing the skill, intelligence, and solidarity required to orchestrate such events without ever being caught. In both cases, the story was shared in hushed tones, its details preserved carefully so as not to attract unwanted attention, but compelling enough to ensure that it would not be forgotten. Traveling workers, tradesmen, and visiting overseers helped carry the story beyond its place of origin. By the time it reached distant counties, the narrative had grown into a fully fledged legend, with every retelling adding elements of suspense and marvel. Some described seeing figures in the fields, making strange gestures just before another overseer fell victim. Others swore that the mere presence of certain workers could create tension so intense that visitors felt unsettled, sensing something they could not see. The story became a shared part of plantation culture in Georgia, a tale that people referenced not only in conversation, but also in cautionary warnings for newcomers. Newspapers and local accounts occasionally hinted at the events, though they were careful to frame them as unusual medical phenomena, rather than openly attributing them to the workers. These references, sparse as they were, added credibility to the stories circulating by word of mouth, giving the legend a sense of documented history without ever revealing the full truth. Over time, the story was told and retold across generations, eventually becoming a part of the folklore of the region. The spread of the story also contributed to a culture of fear and hyper-vigilance among overseers, even those far removed from the original plantation. Men who had never experienced blindness firsthand reported feeling anxiety at the mere mention of the tale, aware that the events were strange and unexplained, and fearing that the invisible force could strike them as well. Parents and elders warned younger overseers about the dangers of underestimating the subtlety and intelligence of the enslaved population. By the late 19th century, the story had cemented itself as both legend and warning. Plantation owners told it as a lesson in humility, overseers told it as a reminder of vulnerability, and the workers told it as a story of ingenuity and resilience. Though many details had likely shifted over time, the essence remained the same: a silent trick, 19 blinded overseers, and the enduring question of how it had been accomplished. The story's spread into legend ensured that, long after the plantation and its original inhabitants had faded from daily memory, the events continued to haunt conversations, leaving an indelible mark on the collective memory of Georgia's plantations and the generations who lived and worked within their shadows. Even today, when historians or folklore enthusiasts recount the tale, it carries a sense of awe and unease. The story has survived not because it was fully understood, but because it was impossible to forget. The combination of mystery, fear, and the inexplicable nature of the events created a narrative that transcended its time, ensuring that the silent trick and its consequences would continue to echo in Georgia folklore for decades, if not centuries, to come.